Well, thank you everyone for joining. We'll give everyone a couple minutes just to get in. I know it's around lunchtime on the West Coast. Thank you all for joining, though. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes here. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. We'll get started here in about one more minute. All right. Well, again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. This is something that I've been wanting to get out for quite a while and is very near and dear to my heart. Let's see here. We don't have a ton of slides. We're going to get through a couple slides, talk about how the MID server is kind of configured, what it does, a little bit of, we're not going to go into setup today at all. This is really more about what a MID server does, how it works, how it communicates with an instance, and what you can do with a MID server to kind of extend everything else that you're doing with the ServiceNow platform. Let's get through some of the niceties. So like I said, we're going to talk about some of that. We'll talk about flows and how they work with the MID server, because it's a little bit different than how we traditionally worked with the MID server many years ago. And then my favorite subject, custom code execution on the MID server. We may not get through all of this part, the custom Java jar code file. We may have to put off till the next one because I want to leave some time for Q&A at the end, but we shall see. So first off, little introduction. My name is Chris Nanda. I'm a manager of technology here at VETS. I've been doing software development for about 20 years now or so, but I've had 14 years on the ServiceNow platform. I spent 5 of that at ServiceNow in core platform engineering, and I also had the honor to start customer success at ServiceNow. I owned my own services company before, and then left there to go on board at ServiceNow, and then now I'm here at Vets. But I'm very passionate about the platform. Um, Deeply into the technology side. Ever since I started working on the platform, I started decompiling the MID server, working through some of the code that the MID server is actually built off of, and figuring out different ways that we can use it, because the MID server allows us to do some interesting things that we can't do on the instance. Um, that being said, a lot more has been added to the ServiceNow instance over the years, but things like the PDF generation that you can do now and other things along those lines that we didn't have APIs for back in the day were all things that we could then do through the MID server through some custom execution. So this was very prevalent at that point. And then now, as more organizations are adopting ServiceNow and porting legacy applications or disparate applications within an organization, there's going to be pinpoint needs to be able to do some custom connections or custom code execution with certain things that you want to do on the platform. And traditionally the answer to that is, well, you just can't, or maybe you find another SaaS application that you can connect to. But fortunately, we have the ability to do some custom execution through this. But first off, let's start off with communication. The MID server is a little bit of a misnomer. MID server is really a MID server service or a MID server application. And what that means is it's an application that ServiceNow provides that allows you to add this service or application onto a Windows server or a Linux server within your infrastructure, whether that is a private cloud, let's say, or on-premise data center. And it allows for functionality so that ServiceNow can access resources within your infrastructure. So most common ones that you've probably seen are Active Directory, SCCM, maybe some REST applications that you have exposed on your intranet or within your network infrastructure. The other common one is Discovery. All of these things go through the MID server. And essentially what's happening there is the MID server is using polling to ask ServiceNow for work to do. But we'll get into a little bit more about that in a second. The nice thing is all of it's over port 443 HTTPS, so nothing has to be opened up on your firewall that isn't normally accessible from devices inside your network infrastructure to the outside internet, or I should say that it isn't easily available. Because these days with zero trust, we want to make sure only things have access to call out that are actually granted access. Some of the typical things are, let's see, REST, Discovery, SOAP integrations. Those are probably the most common that go through the MID server. But outside of that, the nice thing is we have the ability to do just about anything else as well. The architecture. So for those of you who are kind of more developmentally inclined, the MID server uses a publish and subscribe mechanism, utilizing the BayUX protocol on top of Commit D. Basically, all of that is just a bunch of names for the MID server calls out and looks at a particular messaging queue to get work to do, and then downloads whatever that message says, and then goes out and executes that. The queue that it's looking at is called the ECC queue. ECC queue, when it comes to ServiceNow, is as simple as just another table. In the end, the ECC queue is no different than any other table within ServiceNow, and it's kind of an interesting concept because they just happen to use this one table as the messaging queue for the MID server. But it has a lot of power, and something actually came up on LinkedIn just yesterday that I'll touch on at the end of our conversation here around security, which is something that I've considered before, but it's even more of an issue today than it ever has been. Some of the things that ServiceNow's changed over the years. 10, 12 years ago, everything went through the ECC queue. pretty much was all in plain text. Base64 encoded for a lot of stuff, but all in all, it was usually in plain text. So we even had to send credentials through the mid server, through the ECC queue to the mid server. Pretty soon after that, and one of the first updates that ServiceNow did on the mid server were credential stores. And so now when you store credentials within your ServiceNow instance, we don't have to worry about those credentials going out through the ECC queue in plain text. The mid server will actually do a connection back to the instance to pull down the credentials that it needs. So that way they're always held secure. You never have to worry about them getting converted into plain text in transport over to the mid server. Because like I said, when you're looking at the ECC queue, it's just an XML payload, and we'll take a look at that in just a few minutes. But ultimately, it was very insecure at that time. There are certain instances that you'll still see some of that. Actually, you'll see a base64 encoded authorization value in very limited, but in certain circumstances, you'll still see that going through the mid server. All right, that's all for PowerPoint. So no death by PowerPoint today. Let me go ahead and switch over to an instance, and we'll start talking about the good stuff. Let's see where we will start with the ECC queue. This is a fairly informal webinar, you'll probably notice. So like I said, I want to do a lot of Q&A at the end and see what you guys want to know right now, what we can get to in another follow-on video, and then anything we can't discuss during this session, I will follow up with answers either out on a website or in a follow-on video, because I want to do quite a bit more when it comes to mid servers, because it's really a cool option for us. So ECC queue, this is what it looks like. Like I said, it's just another table, but you've got some key aspects that you need to take note of. Excuse me. So the agent is going to be the mid server that it's going to go out to. And what you'll notice sometimes is things will get duplicated in here. None of these should be duplicates, but when you've got clustering configured, what will happen is a record will get created in the ECC queue as pointing to the cluster, and then ServiceNow will then operate on that to determine what mid server within that cluster actually needs to get the message, and then reinsert a new message within the ECC queue just to that particular mid server. So that's kind of a very simplified way of how clustering works. I actually don't see a lot of people doing clustering these days. It's really good for failover when you've got critical services in production, but I don't see a lot of people talking about it or utilizing it in production these days. So I'd be interested to know, what everybody's take is on that down the road. But anyway, then you've got your topic, name, and source. These are kind of going to be the next three major piece of information that you need going through the ECC queue, because it pretty much is what controls what is going to happen through the ECC queue. And just remember, the reason I'm starting with this is when you're using Flow Designer, when you're using orchestration, the old, based off of workflow, if you're using REST message, so if you're in a REST message record and you choose use mid server, in the end, everything is going to go through here if it's going to the mid server. And so when you're debugging, one of the first places I always go and look is straight to here, because you're going to be able to see what is being sent to the mid server and what is coming back from the mid server. So if you're getting errors in your REST message or whatnot, or errors in your flow, a little bit different, but we'll talk about that, or errors in other places, you can usually come here to find some of that debugging information that you might need. But from what we can see here, you can see that we've got a topic called REST probe here, and then a name called get, and a source, which is an IP address with an endpoint. This just happens to be, I've got security operations set up on here with a Splunk connector. And so this happens to be a REST probe that is being used, that gets sent out to query Splunk for certain information. But it's it's interesting because these aren't just random pieces of information. This actually controls what is the mid server is going to do. And so when the mid server goes out and pulls that message down, it's going to first look at the topic. It's going to say, all right, what am I supposed to do? This is essentially the probe that it's going to operate on. A probe traditionally in ServiceNow is anything that the mid server needs to execute. If you're familiar with discovery, you maybe remember probes and sensors. It's really the same type of idea. A probe is something that goes out to the mid server to go execute or go do something. And then in discovery, the sensor is what processes the data when it comes back. And so back in the day, we used to create probes and sensors as a script include to create this message. So I'd have a script include that put together an XML payload, and I'll dig into this in just a second, but it would put together an XML payload to generate this record in the ECC queue. And then I would have an async business rule on the ECC queue, so that when the result or output, or sorry, in this case, input record comes back from the mid server to ServiceNow, it would then execute and I could process what comes back. But it was really nice, and it's even easier now because then I could do some custom functionality on the mid server. Then when that data gets returned, I can operate on that data. So let's take a look at what these look like. I'm going to open up both of these. One thing you'll notice when I get over to here is the queue. You've got an output and an input and then a state. Key thing for this is output queue is what the mid server is going to pick up to go do. The input queue is the result of that operation. And what you will have is a response to. And you can see here that I have this input record and this output record, and the input record has a response to, and that is a reference to this record here. All right, so we're going to look at the output first. So the output of this is kind of interesting. It's just an XML payload. It gives us some information that's encoded. The reason it's encoded is because it's an XML payload, and these days most people don't like XML, even ServiceNow. So when I was at ServiceNow, we would usually just encode a JavaScript object and then put that JavaScript object URI encode it and then put it into an XML payload. So that way it's a little bit easier to pass back and forth. Just as a side note, completely mid-server separate, you can do the same thing through Glide Ajax because all that's over XML, but you can encode a JavaScript object and then send that back and forth, so that way you can send some complex objects. But here, and let me see if we can pull this up. So this isn't a very nice view of it, but I can pull up the XML view of this. And this is what that XML payload looks like. It's essentially just a bunch of parameters that get passed, and then the mid server gets to choose what it's going to do. All of the mid server probes are fairly well, not all. Most of the mid server probes are fairly dynamic, meaning that because the message gets to determine what's going to be executed, and because the Java the runtime can load up lib or jar files, libraries on startup, you can have different sets of jar files on the mid server and then restart your mid server, and then it will load those jar files and then they'll be available to the runtime. Then when a message comes down with a particular type of probe, your code will be executed. In this case, it's a Rust probe. We can see here, I've got a password right here that is being sent. This is what I'm talking about. So there's a couple different ways that credentials can get passed. Number one is this encryption value. So ServiceNow has a built-in encryption system now for most of how it's going to pass inline passwords, but then it will also executed against the credentials table. So that way, if you're running like PowerShell and things like that, it will go out and grab those and try multiple PowerShell or Windows credentials. We can see here that we've got our message headers, message parameters, skip sensor. This is a common one now. It used to be less common to see in the platform because sensors are like I was mentioning before. A sensor is what the platform was going to do to process the data coming back from a probe. Well, ServiceNow has made tons and tons of updates since this was originally introduced and since probes and sensors were originally introduced. So now most of the responses you're going to see is actually going to say skip sensor because something else within the platform is going to be watching for that and operate on the results that that come back. And there's some even more interesting things that I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's actually gotten pretty intricate. So then you've got a source, which this is the same thing that we saw in the in one of the other columns on the ECCQ record, but it's the source. This is what's actually going to try and execute against. So I just did a simple, or this is just a simple GET request that's going out to get data from this particular endpoint. Our HTTP method, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but ultimately you've got your source table and source record, and then we also should have our, oh no, this is the output. So yeah, so that's going to be the output record, and then the mid server is going to come in, pick this up, and then go execute on this saying, okay, well, this is a REST probe. It's going to then dynamically load the class for REST probe into its process function within the primary probe execution on the mid server, and then run whatever it needs to based off of the content that it finds in this message. So then our input record looks a little bit different. Let me pull this up here. It is actually a XML payload that has an XML payload in it. So an encoded XML payload. So you can see here, we've got a result object and an output. If you go and decide to build your own, let's say a JavaScript probe, so you want to just run some JavaScript using some custom code you've written or something like that on the mid server, and you want to write a sensor, you still can do it in the same way that we used to, which is a business rule on the ECCQ. You want to make it async, otherwise it's going to be blocking on the table. And then you'll just use XML document 2 to parse out this result object, and then you would you'd use it first to parse this out, and then you'd have to decode this particular XML payload as well, and then use that. It's a little annoying, but nice thing is we don't really have to do that anymore. And then we've got a whole bunch of other information about the request, the HTTP headers. We've got response information. A lot of this is in support of being able to use this, the out-of-box REST message type of thing, our object, so that way we can log exactly what's going on with those requests. But this is really where, if I'm doing anything with the with a mid server, you know, REST messages, if I'm doing discovery, or even if I'm setting up an SCCM service graph connector, which goes through the mid server, that is a JDBC probe, and then goes out and executes SQL. You can look at all of that here and actually see the data flowing back and forth, and see the rows coming back into the ECCQ. All right, let's move on a little bit here because I want to get into Flow Designer here pretty quickly. But first, I'm going to show you something that's kind of cool. This is something that's locked down on most instances. It didn't used to be. I'm not 100% sure why ServiceNow decided to lock it down to maint. But this is essentially a mid-server script background. So just like you can execute freeform scripts on an instance, this is how you can execute a freeform script on the mid server. And I jumped over something, so I do apologize. So let me talk about this a little bit. Uh, the mid server itself is a Java application. I kind of mentioned that earlier. ServiceNow as a whole, the ServiceNow platform, uses a JavaScript framework, or execution framework called Mozilla Rhino. I'm not even sure we can really attribute it to Mozilla anymore, ultimately, because ServiceNow has maintained it and made updates to it severely over the years. But the mid server has a subset of that execution on it. From my knowledge up to this point, and I'm going to do some more testing, but I don't believe any of the scoped application changes have been pushed down to the mid server Rhino execution framework. One of the key things that's really nice is most of the packages calls that we used to be able to do within ServiceNow are still available on the mid server. And then what that means is, well, first, let me show you this. So MS is the mid server. So just like we have the GS object in ServiceNow, I can execute this and it's going to go out to the mid server and come back. And it shows it to me just as if it executed it on the instance, but that actually went out and executed it on the mid server and returned the result to me. And I can go take a look at my queues. And I see here it executed a script system command, and I can see my input right here. And so the output is script test, just like you would see in script's background. So this is a really useful feature. So again, I'm not 100% sure why ServiceNow locked it down. But I am not going to go into on this recording how you can gain access to it. There are ways to do that, and I would suggest if you're testing things out, that's the only time I would really ever enable it. But it's a really nice testing tool when I'm building out mid-server script includes. So, so ultimately, the mid server, like I said, is running a baseline version of this Rhino framework. So it allows us to run JavaScript on the mid server. That in and of itself is nice, but because of the fact that it's not locked down, meaning because this Rhino framework is built on Java, and ultimately all of your JavaScript code, and this is the same thing that happens in ServiceNow, is actually getting compiled into Java bytecode, regular Java bytecode. Because that's happening, when on the mid server, because it's not locked down, we have the ability to execute Java functions. So we can instantiate Java objects. We can here. Give me 1 second here because one of my browsers closed right before I was in this. I just need to get my exact code here. Let me go back here. And so var str equals new packages.java.lang.string. ms.log str. This should return to me tester, but it's doing it based off of an actual Java object string. So instead of having to be confined to the JavaScript functions and JavaScript objects, I can get actual access to the Java runtime doing this. This opens up so many doors to us. ServiceNow does this, and you can see in not that one here. These are called mid-server script includes. Just like your instance script includes, these are defined as a class using the prototype server. But let's find a Good one. I apologize. I should have had one of these already ready to go. But yeah, let's use AWS API command. So just like our instance side script includes, you can see here it does a AWS API command class.create, but then you can see here all of these packages objects, because we can access everything from the Java runtime. String map, mid config parameter, stuff from Apache, basically, not basically, anything that is loaded into the Java runtime for the mid server application can be accessed through JavaScript. And I know this sounds or may sound, if you've never really thought about a need for it or thought about what you might be able to do with the mid server, but this basically opens up any door you possibly want to be able to execute code on the mid server, to the point where I've actually written a web server running on the mid server, meaning inside of the ServiceNow mid server application, I wrote a ongoing service which opened up port 80 and received requests and passed those requests back to the ServiceNow instance. This was, I've never had to do it again, but back in the day, not Citrix, but one of the support companies that did devices that were on premise for remoting, so that the help desk could remote in. It wasn't the go-tos or anything like that. It didn't support any type of authentication, but they wanted to integrate with ServiceNow, and it was on premise. And so one of the options was to open up a and this was a long time ago, open up a processor on ServiceNow that was open authentication, meaning no authentication, which I was not I wasn't going to do. And so essentially what I did was I wrote a web server that was running inside the mid server, which it would connect to, and then the mid server would pass that data back up. So even though it technically was unsecured because of the fact that it was HTTP protocol, but it all stayed within the customer's network infrastructure. So it at least was more secure. I wouldn't say it was secure, but anyway. Now, all of this is leading up to one thing that I really think is the kit and caboodle that ServiceNow has done for us, because I can write my mid-server script includes to do some code. I can go and create my own Java jar files, and I can come here to mid-server jar files and upload my jar file that I've created, so I can write my custom Java code. I can do my normal software development process and lifecycle testing, all of that stuff, and then I can upload that jar file here. It will then get synced with the mid server, all of your mid servers actually automatically, and then and load that jar file into the runtime. And then I can access all of the classes that I've created within that jar file from my script include. Now from there, we get to Flow Designer. And I'm really, really happy ServiceNow did this, because it makes it so much easier. And I'm gonna start off by looking at an out-of-box one, then I'll show you the test one that I was just showing on my screen. But one of the utilities that ServiceNow did, and this is exactly the type of utility that I've been doing for years on ServiceNow that I love, is using the mid server to do things I just can't do on the instance, like zipping files. And so ServiceNow has added utilities. This is an out-of-box integration hub utility pack that ServiceNow has, but it basically, you define your zip file, what you want to be in it. So all the files that need to go into this zip file, and then it sends the information down to the mid server, and the mid server is actually doing the zipping of it and then sends it back. And so you can see here, this is an action. So I'm not going to go too deep into Flow Designer and how it works, but you can see up here, this is an action. For anyone not familiar with Flow Designer, essentially you have flows, which are multiple actions put together to define a process. You have subflows, which are reusable sets of those, which are multiple actions that define a process that can then be embedded in another flow. And then the actions are the individual things we want to do, such as make a REST call or build a zip file. And so in this case, one of the steps that you can use is build zip. And you can see here at the top, there's a required runtime. So let me just switch over here. The default is instance. And so this is the default required runtime when you use this script step. These are called steps. So in an action, you have multiple steps. Um, Maybe I can do a Flow Designer webinar next if we want to get into custom stuff on here. But ultimately, a script step is it. One part of this action is it goes out and executes this script. Well, the key thing here is I can choose mid server and then pass in the mid server, or I can do it auto choose any of that, the stuff that I want to do here. But now automatically for me, it's going to execute this script right here on the mid server, just like I was doing from that mid scripts background before. And so I can build this into my flows automatically or easily, and then it'll automatically execute it on the mid server and return the results to me. And so I don't have to do all of the stuff that I had to do 10, 12 years ago, creating a sensor, putting it on the CCQ, um, uh, processing all of the results and things like that myself is done for us right here. And the results then get returned to the mid server. So this is uh, I'm looking forward to, because I just started playing around with this functionality in the Flow Designer a couple of months ago, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what I can do with this, because like I started off our conversation or our presentation here with, some of the things that we used to have to do are like PDF generation, or in this case zip generation. If you need to do certain functionality that your developers do today, or if you're looking to port applications that you currently have in .NET, in Java, et cetera, into ServiceNow, you can do that far easier because you don't have to worry about losing functionality in the end. So that is just absolutely huge to me. All right, so last thing with code, we're going to get away from JavaScript and Java, and we're going to move into PowerShell. So I'm going to only lightly touch on PowerShell right now, because I want to do a whole nother webinar on just PowerShell and .NET and all of this stuff. But the same type of thing can be done in PowerShell. So the mid server can execute. It has a built-in runtime for JavaScript, Rhino, but it also can execute PowerShell. Unfortunately, ServiceNow hasn't updated yet. I'm waiting on a response back to see if it's on the roadmap, but PowerShell still only works on Windows, even though the actual PowerShell 7 is cross-platform at this point. To actually execute PowerShell right now is only on Windows, and inside the code on the mid server, it actually checks to see, if you're trying to execute PowerShell, it checks to verify you're on Windows. Otherwise, it'll error out. But it is the same type of thing where if I want to execute PowerShell, I have the same tools at my disposal. Let me go over here. So the names are a little weird, so I just want to call this out. Mid server script includes are JavaScript. They're just like my instance side script includes. Mid server script files are PowerShell script files. Again, back in the day, I actually was able to use the jar files that I was showing you, that table that syncs with the mid server. It's fairly non-discriminatory, and so before mid server script files existed, we would actually use jar files to sync PowerShell scripts to the mid server. But this is where you're going to find everything from back in runbook automation, then orchestration, and now flow designer, you'll find all of the PowerShell scripts here in mid server script files. And you can see I've got lots of different things that are even duplicative because some of them are from the spokes, some of them are Active Directory from orchestration. We've got a CCM spoke. I think I've got some of the additional orchestration stuff here. Here's the original PowerShell orchestration utilities for workflow and things like that. But again, so same type of thing. If I go back to Flow Designer, where is it? If I add a step here, I think I've got it. Good. Some of these aren't installed by default, and you've got to install them in packs. So if you end up not seeing some of these steps, I know REST is one of them. I think PowerShell, and there's a couple other steps that don't come by default on the platform sometimes. So you have to actually request those plugins be installed, just in case if you're trying to build these. But same type of idea here. Now PowerShell doesn't give me the option to run this anywhere other than the mid server because of the fact that I can't run PowerShell on ServiceNow because it's a Java application, and that would actually be fairly insecure. So from here then though, I can choose my mid server script file if I want, or I can do an inline script. And it's really up to you how you want to do it. I like using the script file mainly because then I can, and actually this is why I want to do a whole webinar just on this. You can configure a PowerShell environment to mimic the mid server. Because the mid server doesn't just go and execute your script file. It doesn't literally just take your script file that's in here and send it down to be executed. It'll send it down to be executed, but what ServiceNow does is there's multiple wrappers, PowerShell wrappers that happen around your script that execute first. And some of the things about trying to debug PowerShell when it's running on the mid server, you'll get errors in the wrapper, or you'll get errors in your code, which is it's kind of difficult and annoying to debug. So what you can do is you can set up an environment that actually loads up all of those PowerShell scripts that ServiceNow does and executes it in the exact same way that the mid server does. That way you can test in that way. I found this out a little while ago when I was doing some Active Directory stuff, and it made my life so much easier. So I'm going to do either a webinar or a video on that a little bit later. One last thing I'm going to add, because there's one other thing I want to talk about and show. But when it comes to PowerShell, PowerShell is built on .NET, so Microsoft.NET. Anything that's built in .NET can be run from PowerShell. So this is why I was saying before, all of the people that you may have internally that are doing Java development or .NET development, you can port a lot of your code to be functional still, even when you're calling it from ServiceNow. So you can load .NET libraries into PowerShell, into the PowerShell runtime. You can create your mid-server script file, which will load up those libraries and then use those libraries from PowerShell and return the results. So for all intents and purposes, you can execute any code you really want, because that gives you the two compiled languages that are a big deal. When it comes to Node.js or anything else, you can execute command line commands as well from the mid server. So you can call the Node.js command line tool or any other command line tool that you might need to, as long as it's available on the mid server that you've got configured. All right, last thing that I was playing around with. Like I said, back in the day, everything went through the ECC queue. And technically, everything gets started from the ECC queue still. And all of the old functionality is still there, but there is one type here that you might have seen, the iPaaS action probe. If I open this up, let me open up one of these outputs. there's not a whole lot of information here, and definitely not much that you can decipher, which was driving me nuts. So you've got some engine config, remove ops, some information about the user, the reporting, whether or not it's going to run in the foreground or whatnot. But that's about it. There's no other information. So this is all when I execute. When I executed my REST message, when I executed my mid server script, when I executed my PowerShell from Flow Designer, this is all you're going to see in the ECC queue, which is, it's nice because it's ServiceNow made it more robust, but it's also a lot more difficult to debug because you're not going to see your errors here anymore, which is kind of frustrating to me. So one of the things I did was I wanted to know, okay, what the heck is happening? What's going on? Where can I look in the instance? And I'm still drilling into some of this information, but where can I look in the instance that's actually going to tell me what's getting passed and back and forth and what's happening? So there's lots of options out there. I'm just using this one. This is called MIT proxy. This is a proxy that I've just got running right on my desktop here. The mid server, the test proxy mid server that you saw is also running on my desktop. And I am running the mid server through this proxy. And so that way I can see everything that's happening between ServiceNow and the mid server. And so once I did this, it kind of showed me a little bit more. And I waited on, normally I used to start with this, but I waited to talk about exactly what ServiceNow is using for a connection until I showed this. So originally out of box, ServiceNow mid server would poll ServiceNow, just do a SOAP request every 5 minutes for work to do. It would check that ECC queue every 5 minutes, which had a, it's got a pretty good lag time. Real time work being done on the mid server wasn't too great or anything like that. ServiceNow decreased that and decreased that and decreased that. We used to run it at a minute, but there's only so much you can do when doing a SOAP request over and over again. So then they moved to the BAUX Comet D protocol. What that's doing is it's using ServiceNow's AMB or asynchronous message bus. So like I said, this is why I said this is a deep dive, because this is stuff that you don't really need to know. I just find it very interesting, and it lets me know some of the things that I can look at. All right, any better now? Awesome. Thank you. Sorry about that. My headset died. I'm in summer in Wisconsin, and I've got an air conditioner that's sitting next to me, so I'm not using my normal mic that I usually do, and I think my old headset battery doesn't last nearly as long. Okay, so I'll go back a little bit. So ServiceNow uses, with its change over the past number of years, it's using that BAUX Comet D protocol, and so it's doing long polling, as you can see on the screen here. Long polling. Long polling just says, hey, I'm going to open up an HTTP request, and then when you have something for me to respond, or have something to send me, you can respond. And so it's basically just an open connection, and then eventually it'll time out, and then it'll make another one. That's what long polling is in a nutshell. But the big thing about that is now it's near real time. And so as soon as something gets added to that ECC queue, it's going to get pushed out to the mid server, or pulled by the mid server, I should say. By the way, I do say sometimes pushed out. Technically, nothing is ever pushed from the instance. It's always pulled by the mid server. So I hope that doesn't confuse anyone. But the proxy here is showing us what happens. And if I scroll up, well, here I'm gonna just execute one right now just to go a little faster. That. So we can see a bunch of stuff is happening right now. All right, so the first thing it did was it connected and it said, all right, keep alive, channel, yada, yada, yada. Oh, here we go. It got results. So this is one of the record sets. So this is the ECCQ record. So I've got my ECCQ record in here now. iPaaS action probe, and it's got a source. And so then once it still uses the ECCQ to let the mid server know it has stuff to do, but then you see this here: hub lock, hub plan, hub integration, hub plan. This is where it's actually getting information about what it needs to do. So this is one of the responses, and there's some additional details in here, but you can see here the name is mid server execute script. I think that's what I named mine. Mid server execute script. And then some other information, name, error, eval. So basically what ServiceNow did was they changed how it communicates a little bit, where the ECCQ starts it off, but then the mid server will actually go back and take a look at things that it needs to do. I'm still working on some additional error handling and logging for this to make debugging a little bit easier. Obviously, the debugging isn't bad, because when you're inside of Flow Designer and you run your test, it gives you a really nice breakdown. But the one thing that it doesn't give you is necessarily the output unless you've specifically asked for it in your code. So like if I didn't log the outputs here, because I have no output variables mapped on mine here, I don't necessarily see what the actual output was of the mid server. So I can see a lot of the information down here: define connection. This is the actual script that was run, and the output data. But because of the fact that I don't have it mapped, I don't even get to see it. And without having the proxy set up, I no longer even can see what's being run on the mid server. So there's a few things there. Like I said, I'm in the process of doing some additional work to make that a little bit easier, so we can see a little bit more information on what's going on there. But just keep that in mind. But the debugging here within Flow Designer is exceptionally helpful. Especially, just make sure that you're mapping some of those outputs. You might have to add some additional logging. And then the final thing you can do with that, though, is if you go to your mid server after you've run those, like I was using ms.log, which is just like our glide system gs.log, but except it's on the mid server. I can then come in here and I can grab the mid server logs, and that should be in those mid server logs. So it's a trade-off. I think it's a decent trade-off because Flow Designer is far easier. Let's see here. I think I turned on. Okay. Well, I was just pulling up Q&A. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I always, I wanted to give a couple of minutes here in case anyone has any questions right now. I do have the Q&A turned on, but you can use the chat if you want to as well. I'm taking a look on there now. If I don't get any questions in a minute or so, I will go ahead and adjourn us a little bit here. But as I said, coming out of this, even just talking to you about some of this stuff, I'm going to do an in-depth webinar, either webinar or video on running .NET through PowerShell on the mid server. if you have any questions or any want to know any more about this, feel free to contact me either through LinkedIn or by any other means that you might have. I'm sure there's some contact information on the event. I don't see any questions coming in right now. So, okay. Actually, thank you, Brian. So, maintaining mid servers, there's been a lot of changes over time, and I will fully admit I haven't fully adopted all of them. ServiceNow is really trying to move to Docker to for all of the mid servers. So they offer Docker containers and the instructions on creating Docker containers. I love Docker in general, but I've had some issues with upgrading mid servers that are in Docker. Um, which, I mean, I guess in theory, the idea is that you don't have to, you can bring down one container and then just bring up another one with the newer version and whatnot. But I haven't fully adopted that yet, so I still run things in the old way. But ultimately, the nice thing is mid servers will auto upgrade by default. You can pin them. And so if you want them to stay on a single version, you can pin them, but you will get an error on the instance if your instance gets upgraded and you have it pinned and you don't upgrade your mid server. And eventually you could get some errors that actually occur where the mid server stops functioning completely. So for the most part, I usually leave it on auto upgrade unless there's something else that some other reason. But also it's part of an upgrade plan for any upgrade. Let's see. I did want to touch on security actually, because I mentioned it earlier. What came up the other day was ServiceNow, and this is, I think it was before my time even. There's an attachment generator that, so in service in the ECC queue, I don't know why they used this particular table, but if you opened up the ECC queue to a web to use one of the web services, because every table in ServiceNow by default gets web services associated with it. It's just automatic. Every table gets web services. Now that can be locked down, but every table has, you can go to !WSDL to get the WSDL for it. You can go, you can look at the REST API for it, all of that. But ServiceNow made a sensor or a processor where I could push data to the ECC queue or push an attachment that's base64 encoded, and then it would create that attachment. Real, it was real handy functionality back in the day, but now when I think about that, it makes me shudder because everything we've talked about, the ECC queue is the entry point to your infrastructure. And so when we're talking about mid-server security, number one, zero trust is the way to go these days. Making sure that every connection from your mid server is trusted and has the kind of the right the authorization that it needs, and only the authorization that it needs, and paths that only the paths that it needs. Because if someone was able to directly insert something into your ECC queue, we've just seen I can run system commands, I can run PowerShell, depending on what you have. If it's a Windows server and you're running it as by default, you're not allowed to, but you can go back in and change it. If you're running the service that the mid server is running as an administrator, you're opening up your infrastructure to whatever that mid server wants to do. And so then if we opened up that ECC queue, somebody could easily gain access and be have malicious intent. And so security is key. By default, out of box, almost all that stuff is turned off, and so you don't really have to worry about it too much. It's just a check to make sure when a new instance is spun up. But these are just things that whenever I see them being said to turn them on, it makes me shudder. Let's see, best practices. The other thing that I always suggest, the nice thing is you can spin up multiple mid servers on one device. And so make each mid server application fairly specific. it's six of one, half dozen of another, but ultimately to me, I'd rather have two mid servers, one for discovery if I'm running full discovery, or six or seven if I'm running full discovery, and then another one for SCCM. That way, the one for SCCM, I can worry about, what it needs to connect to, and then the discovery one can be very specific around the discovery that I'm going to allow for my infrastructure. Let's see. And then, I'm hoping ServiceNow gets a little bit better at this down the road, but maintenance of the mid-server virtual machine is something else that's kind of key. You want to make sure any vulnerabilities get patched and all of that. So make sure the mid-server virtual machine needs to be monitored just like any other device on the network. But because of the fact that it has a high potential, I would probably put it in my high priority, not necessarily high risk, but high priority list for monitoring for vulnerabilities. All right. Well, thank you all for joining today. I will be following up. If anyone has any other questions that didn't get asked today, please reach out. Thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great Friday and a great weekend. Take care.